in the wake of learning about neurodiversity, it brought me right to my roots, to my family, my home environment, to my friends. It really challenged me in all aspects of all my relationships in terms of how I communicate and how I understand. I felt that I was making a lot of assumptions about, I communicated something clearly. How come that person didn't get it? And it has been, it still is. I feel like I'm very much on the journey in this very moment of, uh, communication is critical in all aspects of life. And if we can learn about neurodiversity, um, some consider it a disability, some don't. Some consider it as a way of being. But if we can learn to adjust our communication patterns and styles based on the person in front of us, we can only grow as human beings.
We've been taught there's a right way to think, a right way to communicate, a right way to be. But what if that's the problem? This is the Neurodiversity Voices Podcast, a show about how we think, how we communicate, and what happens when we stop expecting everyone to do both the same way. In today's episode, I'm joined by Justine Jecker. We explore what neurodiversity actually challenges, not just in theory, but in workplaces, healthcare, and everyday conversations. This is a conversation about discomfort, about getting it wrong, about learning in public. Because this isn't about fixing people. It's about rethinking the systems around them. If you're ready to question what you've been taught, let's get into it. Justine, welcome to the podcast.
It's great to be here, Paul. Thank you for having me.
You mentioned earlier that when you recorded your episode on neurodiversity back in 2021, the language was just beginning to emerge in mainstream healthcare.
Yeah, I can speak a little bit to that. So in 2021, the term neurodiversity, I remember having to Google it and look it up, and it was a term that had come out in the 90s, but hadn't really reached mainstream language. And with long COVID kind of starting to pop up and other social factors that were happening in society, so looking at equity, inclusion, diversity, this concept of neurodiversity really came up in the forefront. And as an occupational therapist, this was a term that I realized was pretty niche. It was kind of in the pediatric realm or in those who identified as being ADHD or autistic, but it was really pigeonholed. And so when I did that podcast a few years ago, it was in an attempt to bring it to the mainstream audience and say, this is a term that we should all understand. And especially as therapists, no matter where we're working, how this impacts our day-to-day work.
From your perspective, where do we stand today in terms of society's understanding of neurodiversity?
Yeah, I would say we're still very much in the toddler infant stage of neurodiversity. I do think we have taken some baby steps since COVID times now in 2026. I have seen growth in workplaces where just the term neurodiversity is more understood, or at least somebody has said, "Oh, I've heard that term before." There is still confusion, though, in terms of is this a diagnosable term? Can I self-identify as neurodiverse? There's been some broad questions when people first hear of the term and definition, wondering, isn't everyone neurodiverse? Like, don't we all have neurodiverse perspectives and backgrounds? So I still think we're in a time of questioning, but I have seen that it has translated more into this is a term that people are not hearing for the first time. And there's associations that are being made between people who, okay, sure, have autism, even bipolar disorder, depression, anxiety. These are now linked to understanding neurodiversity. So there has been some growth in the last few years.
Do you think neurodiversity is still viewed as something mainly relevant to education and healthcare rather than society at large?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, yes, it is mainly in education. Certainly, every teacher in their professional development journey is learning about neurodiversity in the classroom and how to support that through accommodations. And that's at all levels, elementary, secondary, and post-secondary education. And in healthcare, what is nice is that it's branched outside of niche pockets, outside of mental health or outside of pediatrics, to more mainstream conversation, so that people, even if you are being seen for a physical injury, there's understanding of, okay, this person might need to receive the information differently. We might not just be able to go through our verbal checklist of all the things that they need to remember during their rehab journey. We might need to write this down. We might need to email. We might need to provide visuals. Um, there's this understanding of knowledge translation needs to happen differently, because that's really a key component of neurodiversity is how information is taken in and also how information is projected to the person in front of you.
What might it take for neurodiversity awareness to expand into all industries?
Yeah, I think part of workplace health and safety, workplace accommodations, workplace return to work, it really gets into the need to review HR policies of workplaces. And I think there's really an opportunity here as we've gone through social movements, as we've moved towards equity, diversity, inclusion. We've moved towards understanding colonialism and its impact. So I think in society, there is a broader understanding of history and how it's impacted us in the workplace, and also how people show up in the day to day. In workplace accommodation, no matter where you're working, there's definitely an opportunity for employers and employees to begin to understand, how does this impact my work on a day to day? Even if I don't identify as being neurodiverse, where is this coming up for me?
Why do people sometimes feel anxious about saying the wrong thing?
Yeah, this is, I've been a clinician for 17 years. And so this never goes away. Even doing this podcast, there's always the fear that you can misspeak, use the wrong word, maybe offend somebody. I think that's the collective journey that we're on in society right now, is that in order to grow, we need to put ourselves out there. And I think neurodiversity is a great example of there are so many questions that we need to ask. We need to ask, what is neurodiversity? What are examples of neurodiversity? And not putting, just like indigeneity, you can't put all Indigenous persons in one basket. The same thing for diversity. It is a cultural experience, but it's also an individual experience. And so I think it's really important for those that are starting the journey to ask questions, to acknowledge, I'm going to make mistakes. I'm going to say the wrong thing. A good example is, we used to say in healthcare, persons with autism, and the autistic community took control of that and said, no, we want to say I am autistic. Like this, some individuals felt strongly that was part of who they are and their personality and their identity. And so you might not find that every single person you're working with is going to call themselves autistic directly, but that's something that you need to be able to be comfortable with. How can I address you? What language is comfortable? I think traditionally healthcare providers are scared of being wrong because we are told that we were the experts once upon a time. And neurodiversity in general flattens the playing field. It is a concept that requires the back and forth, the humility of the person who may be guiding or teaching in some ways, but they have a lot to learn from the person in front of them. And so, yeah, is kind of knowing, acknowledging from the get go that you're going to make mistakes as you begin this journey.
Beyond professional titles, the way people describe their work often reveals something deeper. When people ask what your work is really about beyond the titles, what feels most true to you?
Yeah, the titles have really created a barrier in society for so many reasons. And I think one of the beautiful things about healthcare right now is we're getting back to a humanistic approach. And I believe a century ago, that's really where we were at. It was really humanity helping humanity. As an OT, our profession started 100 years ago. And so on the cusp of World War One, we really emerged as a profession. And it was really about human centeredness. And so over time, with Western ways of knowing, titles became important. Who you are, who has authority over knowledge. It's something I've never really felt comfortable with in my career. And I feel very blessed and fortunate to have a PhD, but it's not less than or greater than. It's just a different form of knowledge. I think in the neurodiverse community, that's what's so beautiful is that there's this idea of different ways of knowing and people have the opportunity to learn from different ways of knowing. And a PhD is just that. It's a different way of knowing and understanding. And I think any of our titles are that. One other thing I'll say about that, Indigenous elders are a great example of they have the title of elder, but until you chat with each elder, you wouldn't know the knowledge that they carry, right? It is individualistic, although there's a collective understanding of what it means to be an elder. And I think in our society, if we can move away from labels and more towards understanding that we're sharing different forms of knowledge, I think that that's where a label might be helpful. Is it kind of tells you, okay, this person might have this background in this knowledge, but certainly it doesn't make you an expert. It makes you knowledgeable in one form of knowledge. And so yeah, I think that it's a humbling place. Neurodiversity is challenging, who is the expert?
How has working with neurodivergent individuals changed the way you communicate or understand other people?
My gosh, Paul, it's been profound for me. It's been a light bulb moment personally in my life. Before COVID and before understanding truly what neurodiversity was, I think it was challenging to communicate with different, what I would consider personalities. And in the wake of learning about neurodiversity, it brought me right to my roots, to my family, my home environment, to my friends. It really challenged me in all aspects of all my relationships in terms of how I communicate and how I understand. I felt that I was making a lot of assumptions about, I communicated something clearly. How come that person didn't get it? And it has been, it still is. I feel like I'm very much on the journey in this very moment of uh, communication is critical in all aspects of life. And if we can learn about neurodiversity, um, some consider it a disability, some don't. Some consider it as a way of being. But if we can learn to adjust our communication patterns and styles based on the person in front of us, we can only grow as human beings. So that's why I think it's really profound, and I think personally it has challenged me as much professionally. And not be scared to take feedback because that's going to happen. We are like I said previously, we are going to make mistakes, and so that's going to come with the territory.
A lot of your work touches ethical questions in healthcare and systems. Where do you see neurodivergent voices being misunderstood, excluded, or oversimplified within systems?
Yeah, I think if we don't conform, right? So the first thing in workplaces, conformity is what workplaces look for. They want you to fit in. They want you to be a cog in the wheel, that everything runs smoothly in your day to day. Those who experience different forms of neurodiversity aren't necessarily going to wake up with that at the front of their mind, right? So whether it's being very direct, maybe not showing certain emotions, doesn't mean that they're not present or not being kind, but it's just not perceived by the collective as well. Um, I think that that's the key, is being able to be comfortable that people are going to express themselves differently. And from an ethical lens, our workplaces have to allow for that to happen. So the policies need to support that people have the right to express themselves differently. Uh, Somebody might appear to be confrontational when really they're just asking questions because they really don't understand. So it could be as serious as something being considered insubordination, because an individual just they can't communicate with their boss clearly. And the boss is seeing that as you're not following, what you're supposed to be doing. Or it could be more, less serious. It could be in the social setting of the workplace, but that can have big consequences to maybe being left out of the social gatherings, or people not bringing you under their wing. So it's incumbent upon us to have curiosity. If somebody shows up and you think that they're in a bad mood, or there's a behavior that is present regularly and you're trying to understand it, we do have an individual responsibility. And I think that that's what's unique in the neurodiverse community. It's incumbent upon all of us to ask questions and to try to understand, not just the leader. Of course, the leader needs to lead in the workplace. They need to lead by example. They need to create opportunities for people to learn about this. But it is a day-to-day, like, I show up, and I need to respect that people are in different places and have different communication styles. And I think ethically, just going back to that focus, is probably many people have lost jobs or not been able to get jobs, or have not, their skill set is not matched with the right job that they should be in, because we decide as a society that they're not fitting the mold.
How do ethical frameworks sometimes fail to account for different kinds of minds?
Yeah, oh wow. Our ethical frameworks, there is this idea of right and wrong, right? It's a very black and white situation, and ethics has a lot of grayness. So I think I think trying to find a specific example. So other than communication, there could be even um, expectations on the workers. So conforming to the workday hours and everybody achieving their optimal performance between 9 and 5. If we're really trying to appeal to inclusivity and neurodivergent individuals, we need to try, there needs to be that halfway point. So if we see that there's this brilliant skill set and we want that person in our workplace, what accommodations can we provide to ensure that maybe they need an 11 to 7 schedule or a 12 to 8 schedule to support their being at optimal performance. And so I do think the ethical frameworks currently, there might be one or two out there, but they haven't yet I guess, accounted for individuality. There's this idea that we all think and operate the same, and therefore there's a black and white truth. But I don't think for those that experience neurodiversity, that's the greatest challenge. Is, you know what, we don't fit the mold, and so we need a framework that supports us. And employers might start to realize that if they can incorporate those ethical frameworks with neurodivergent perspectives, that they're going to get a better bang for their buck, so to speak, from a business perspective, because they're going to get that person when they're at their optimal and best, as opposed to conform and fit in.
You gave an example about internal clocks and sleep cycles, how systems often assume everyone functions the same way. What would flexibility in systems actually look like?
Yeah. So, excuse me, just to give a specific example, working with kiddos with ADHD and autism, there is there's a kind of a collective truth that sleep is a challenge, right? So, waking up later in the mornings or going to bed later or needing a nap in the middle of the day, uh, I think that in a lot of cultures, there are ways to mitigate. I think I have a European background, so I'll use that as an example. But, siestas and siestas are really common, taking those afternoon breaks to let the brain relax, to allow the energy to change. I think there's opportunity for us in North American culture to learn from other cultures who perhaps have been supporting neurodiversity for a long time, but they didn't necessarily say we're supporting neurodiversity. So I think what would benefit neurodiverse populations, like sleep cycles is a good example, would probably benefit all populations because we need more breaks than we're taking at work, or we need to have a different work schedule that's really getting us at our optimal time. And I think matching the skill set. So one of the other pieces is, it's known that individuals with high IQs often fit into the neurodiverse population. So they're producing work at a very, very, very high rate. They could do work in 3 hours, maybe what the average person needs 8 to 10 hours to do. How is that being compensated? If you've got a genius at work here, is it the product that they're producing? If they can do the same work in a third of the amount of time, are employers, are they amenable to that work style versus somebody who needs longer period of time to complete the same task?
The word disability itself carries a lot of assumptions. What ethical assumptions about disability do you think still need challenging?
Hmm. Yeah, I think there's been a shift towards, I've seen throughout my career when I graduated, it was still very much in the physical realm of rehabilitation. Mental health was certainly a component of my training, no question. But I think in society, if you have a great example is when you get the disability permit to put in your parking window dash. If people see you walk out of the car and you don't have a physical instrument with you, there's like a taboo moment, like you're illegally parking somewhere, or how did you get that parking sticker? And so we have evolved from that to understand that the majority of disabilities are invisible. You will not see like the slew of mental health, all the experiences neurodivergent individuals have. There is a lot that is not seen. And so that has evolved, but I still think there's still a lot of growth that can happen for us to get to a place of acceptance in our community. That I think a great example too is I'd seen in a grocery store parking lot. So you have parking spots for those, with the physical disability sign. You have those with families, and there was actually a sign that said like those who need to be closer. And it's a bit of an honor system, right? To be able to, who is that person? Like, but they know they need to be closer for whatever reason. Maybe the grocery store is overwhelming and finding a parking spot and all the chaos that happens in grocery store parking lots. But I think I do see those baby steps towards, and I'll use equity from a gender lens as another example, but bathrooms becoming just bathrooms in public places. Great example of, for those who experience or might identify as a different gender, uh, being able to take away stigma, because what persons with disabilities and persons who identify in LGBTQTA1 plus communities, there are similarities in terms of how they're perceived in society. And I think that's why when I mention these major social movements, there's overlap between them because it's how we're seeing one human being to another. And disability is a good example of, our communities are still designed by able-bodied people for the most part. Um, and we can do better. We should have neurodivergent voices in projects when things are getting built from the ground up.
How does the neurodiversity movement push society to rethink those assumptions?
Hmm. I think there's resistance because I think there's always fear when there's always fear when as a society we're challenged. This is the first time in human history where collective voices can be heard about different issues. And so when George Floyd happened and the Black Lives Matter movement happened, there is this idea that we're not going to stay silent any longer. Like, as a society, we need to talk about this. As a society, we need to talk about inclusion. As a society, we need to talk about colonization and its impacts on everyone living in Canada, especially Indigenous populations. And I think with disability, it's no different. And so I think as a society, what the challenge is that we have so much awareness now. There's so much knowledge out there. And it's a matter of how do we slowly digest these massive things that have been happening over decades and perhaps even centuries, certainly in the case of colonization, over centuries. So I invite all of us to be gentle with ourselves, to try and find something each day that we can say, okay, I can do better in this, whatever this is. So if it is understanding a coworker who identifies in a certain way, that will be your intention for that day. Because this is a journey we're on. It's not going to happen in my generation, in my lifetime, but we certainly can. We can take big steps as if we're individually making an intention, collectively we can make those big steps together. But one of the things that I had the fortune of working in Thunder Bay for a decade and with many First Nation communities. And one of the lessons I learned there is, for whatever issue we've gotten ourselves into, it takes us 7 generations to get out of it. And that's a good way of thinking, is that we are in a healing process of society. So having an open lens, if we need to change the way we're functioning, it is for the greater good. It is for the lives of our children and grandchildren. And so there is an expectation to go beyond yourself. And I think that that's the invitation to society right now, is go beyond yourself to be able to give back and try and, create a safer space. Because I think that's what we're ultimately talking about when we talk about disability, neurodivergent populations, and these movements, is that we're allowing people to show up as they are.
You gave the example of the Olympics and Paralympics being treated as separate hierarchies of ability. What does that reveal about how society frames ability and difference?
Yeah, Paul, that was a great pre-podcast discussion. It's funny. I've had this kind of innate thinking since I was in my early 20s, about 20 years ago, when one day I was watching the Olympics and I just thought, I don't understand why the Paralympics are separate. Like, in fact, they're entirely different sports. Like, they're not even the same sport. So why wouldn't we just have one Olympics with all individuals? And I know people have very strong opinions on this, so this is just one of many opinions in the audience, but I feel that it is still an example of dividing, of creating an us and them. The Paralympics certainly doesn't get the coverage that the Olympics gets. Many people forget because it's, 2 weeks after the Olympics. And they tend to tune in if they know someone or someone's from their hometown and they want to follow them. But I just think if, as a society, we were really moving towards an equity lens, there would be one Olympics, and that's one example, right? We often need to center something when a movement happens. In order to bring attention to it, we have to label it. So you would have seen that in the 60s and 70s when we're looking at accessibility legislation that was happening, when we're looking at just this movement of society around disability and in acknowledging all the forms of disability. And that's needed in the beginning of any movement is we need to center this. And I think the Paralympics served its purpose. It's centered this understanding of there are different individuals and we need to make space for diversity. Now, as a society, we've gotten to that point where the inclusion piece can happen. And that's why those words are often used hand in hand, diversity, inclusion, is that there's space for both, but you hope to evolve. You don't want to keep things completely separate indefinitely, right? There's this idea that we will come together in the end.
You spent 5 years hosting OT conversations that matter. What makes a conversation feel meaningful to you?
Yeah, this is my day-to-day personal challenge is that with every person you engage in, you can, one conversation can change someone's life. You know, it can change the trajectory of a relationship. And so we have the power in our words, in our kindness, even when we make mistakes, even when we have a bad conversation. There's a lot of opportunity to be able to grow ourselves and to learn. And this is something I continue to work on is asking more questions, trying to learn about the person in front of me and their perspective. Try not to always give an opinion. I know on this podcast, the whole point is for me to give my opinions, but I think it's in life, listening is a skill that I've really, as I grow older, it's just becoming more and more and more critical in my relationships. Um, and just truly being open, remaining open to different opinions. I think one of the things I learned early on that was very humbling, probably shortly after graduating, there was a few experiences that I had that reminded me that if you want to be right, you're going to be alone, in life. If that's your plan is to prove everyone wrong in a conversation or win the debate, it's not going to be a very fulfilling existence. And so if you can adopt this idea that even, we can have very passionate beliefs about things, but if someone introduces the right information, are you willing to jump ship? And I welcome that. I love, I've had some of my most rich relationships in my life have been at odds typically with not the person, but more the idea in front of me. But when I've realized, that idea, yeah, it took me 3 months, but that idea makes complete sense. And I want to jump on board. And that gets again into the humanity of each of us. Like we carry huge egos. The more titles we have, the more ego we have. And so what does it take for you to let that guard down and say, you know what? You were right. And I wanna be on your bandwagon.
Why do you think podcasts are such a powerful medium compared with academic or clinical writing?
Yeah, I did a podcast on that topic myself, and for millennia around the world, storytelling has been the way of sharing knowledge. That's what we know. It's why we can't trace a lot of our human ancestors, is because there's very little information. But we know that tens of thousands of years ago, civilizations of massive proportion existed, and they shared knowledge through verbal uh, sharing. And I think we are living in a time where we decided, and really Western culture decided, that what is written is what is validated. And the more people who read and write that, it becomes further validated. There is truth in that. There certainly is. Peer review is a great example of you have multiple people who have an expertise in something and they come to consensus that what you've written makes sense. So there is a place for journals, for books. They're forms of knowledge, but I think what podcasts have is it brings to life what is on word. What is on word is like 2% of how we communicate. But when you can see someone in this podcast, you can see how I'm moving my body, my verbal and nonverbal communication skills. When you can hear the sound of my voice, it is very different than getting a transcript that tells you what you and I talked about. And I have learned that the way that somebody says something can stick in my mind for days, weeks, and perhaps even years, depending on what was said. If it's just said in that right way, the power of the word, I personally believe that it still is the best form of knowledge transfer.
What do conversations allow people to express that traditional publications sometimes cannot?
Hmm. I think we can reframe our thoughts. So when a publication happens, it's happening at a pinpoint period in time. It's literally it's like a picture. It's a snapshot in time of that researcher on that day at that time period, maybe that year, let's say. But researchers evolve and grow their thoughts. And in podcasts or when you're sharing in conversation, there's an opportunity to reflect on the past and project into the future. There's this idea of impermanence, right? So nothing is forever set in stone. And so I think conversations carry this fluidity that perhaps other mediums cannot. Although this is being recorded and a podcast will eventually become a set period of time, but it allows us to be more gentle with our viewpoints. It allows us to waver and not be so rigid in our thoughts. And so, in a way, it's perhaps more kind to have a conversation than other forms of communication.
Many listeners of this podcast are neurodivergent themselves or are supporting someone who is. What do you hope neurodivergent or disabled listeners feel after hearing this conversation?
Yeah, I hope they feel heard and seen. Like, I hope they recognize that those who I would not identify as being neurodivergent and those who are allies to the neurodivergent community, that, um, yeah, that there are leaders who are wanting to learn more and day-to-day individuals who are wanting to expand their minds. And I know it can be frustrating. And I'll give a good example that happened not too long ago, but working with a kiddo and his mom, there was some frustration by the mom that the family, even though the kiddo was like 8, 9 years old, the family couldn't understand after 8 or 9 years why the kiddo was behaving the way they were. And they felt exasperated. We've tried to explain so many times what is autism and why these behaviors happen, and they just felt like they were reaching that kind of limit in terms of what they could handle because the larger family support really wasn't there. And so, there's opportunity for those who are learning about neurodiversity to support, create groups for those who are not so that they can learn. And I'll give a personal example that's not neurodiversity related, but it's an example of where if you're not in a community, you can still learn about a community. Growing up, my parents were both alcoholics. And so alcoholism was a big thing. And as me and my siblings did not know how to support this, and in Canada, there's groups called Alateen and Al-Anon, and those are good examples of these are not individuals who are alcoholics themselves, but they're the children or the family members or the partners or the friends of that person, and they need a community themselves to learn. And so, um, yeah, I don't know what exists out there, but I think people are more in tuned and connected now. Like book clubs are a great way. Like there's creative ways that you can engage the community. And I don't think it's necessarily the responsibility of the neurodivergent individual. I think again, it's all of our responsibility to say, you know what, like this is a part of. We've recognized this as a part of life. I have seen a lot of tenderness, like with people who start to once that switch, once they understand what is ADHD or, oh, that's why my mom or dad acted this way. Like now I can make the link because usually it's a familial connection. But in the generation, even I'm a millennial, the generation before us didn't use this term. They didn't recognize what this is, right? So there is a healing moment that happens when you have compassion and understanding. And so, yeah, I think multiple generations need to go through that to learn, that this is something that's possible. And my children who are 9 and 10 are learning about these things that I knew nothing about decades after the fact. So there's definitely advancements happening.
Why is patience so important in this moment of social change?
Oh my goodness, that's the $1,000,000 question. Patience. Paula, I've started to read about Buddhism. This is a new journey for me. I had been introduced in my teens to the concept, but in terms of really understanding and walking the walk, I would say it's relatively new in my life. Patience, it challenges the deepest part of who we are, right? So we have to be settled. We have to be open. We have to not be anxious or defensive. To be in a patient state of mind actually requires a lot of other things to happen inside of you first to be able to engage in patience. And so I would say that the journey of patience starts with the inner healing work that each of us has to go through as human beings. And I am seeing the younger generations engage in that. My kids are starting meditation again. I'm in my 20s, 30s before that even crossed my mind. But if society wants to get on that road of patience and acceptance, it starts with inner awareness and choice to want to go through inner healing. And we all have something to heal from. I think there's misconceptions that you have to have some crazy trauma or something big happen to you to go through healing. And that is just not the case. Like all around us, people are experiencing different things, and that impacts who we are as individuals. And so I think if we can be patient with ourselves and our journeys in life, we get to that point where when a big concept like neurodiversity is introduced to us, we can allow for patience that, okay, maybe this HR policy that we want to implement is going to take 6 months, but at least it's going to happen, right? Like we begin to be more kind for things that take longer period of time. So yeah, in the end, I think it's an individual and collective effort.
Many listeners also work in education, healthcare, or leadership roles. What do you hope non disabled professionals take away from this conversation?
Yeah, that we're blessed each and every day that we live in a world that is predominantly designed for able-bodied, non-neurodivergent experiences. So it's a privilege, really, and I think that starting from that place allows us to be more open to recognizing the challenges that others are experiencing. Again, similar to the conversation around disability in general, is what's good for any individual with a disability tends to be good for everyone. And I would challenge those, like to find an example. Like if we create a good example is sensory rooms. If we create sensory rooms in hospitals, education centers, workplaces, that's going to be good for everyone, just like prayer or spiritual rooms are benefit everyone. So, I think if people recognize that this is a universal benefit, I've yet to see an example of where it wouldn't benefit everyone. That would be interesting to see. I think why not? Like, let's make this happen. And the chances are this is going to be a positive result for all of us. So that's a good starting point if you are not in a disabled or neurodivergent community, that it's, opportunity for openness.
What does humility look like in practice when working with neurodivergent people?
Yes. Humility is that it's honestly through the transformative leadership lens, it's being able to show that you are on equal playing ground, right? So we a lot of our workplaces are in pyramid models, and we're trying to flatten those. Hierarchy still has a role in society, and it's important for people to know who's steering the ship and who's directing where things go. But I think there's opportunities. It's really a permeable experience, I think, throughout the workday. I think if we can acknowledge that pyramids have the opportunity to kind of, just like tents, like to collapse and to go back up. There are times in a work day where you need the tent in full structure for everybody to do what they need to do. There's also opportunities, I would call them the humility opportunities, where that tent is flattened and there's an opportunity for everyone to be in equal discussion with one another without worry of insubordination, without worry of stepping on toes or saying the wrong thing to your boss or whoever. And so, are we creating? I would pose that question to the leaders and those who are listening in the room. Are we creating the opportunities for those flattened experiences to happen, or are we being rigid in staying in kind of that pyramid form?
If society is still in the toddler phase of understanding neurodiversity, what does the next stage of growth look like?
Yeah, the next stage. Oof, this might get to the global, the global perspective, but we we're as humans fearful of what is different, and so um, when that fear is removed, then there's opportunity to go to the next stage. And neurodiversity is another. It can invoke fear for different people for different reasons. Not the unknown is a fear in and of itself. So I think that to get to the next stage is really dispelling the myths and to personalize, who within your circle would identify as being neurodivergent. I think that's a fair and easy exercise for anyone to be able to ask. And I can say, okay, my mother's neurodivergent. I would never have known that language just a few short years ago. And now on a personal note, that's improved our relationship to be able to communicate in a way that I can understand. So getting to that next stage is acknowledging that one, it's more common than you think. And you're probably interacting with neurodivergent individuals every day in multiple settings, when you do your day-to-day routine. And so it's taking off those rose-colored glasses or whatever you want to call it, like opening your eyes to what's around you. And I think that that's going to allow us to get to that next level, that this is as normal as, not smoking in restaurants, which is a good example of me growing up. And here's the smoking, non-smoking section. And the whole restaurant is full of smoke. We are literally in the smoking and non-smoking restaurant right now in the neurodiversity path. And I believe in 10, 15 years, that's not going to happen anymore.
What gives you hope when you think about the future of neurodiversity awareness?
Yeah, I think the kindness from the neurodivergent community in terms of um, seeing children be able to use that language is so hopeful. Yeah, I, I learn a lot from kids, so much so, being a mom, but also being a therapist and seeing how they speak and interact with one another. Like, it's human nature. And what's really beautiful about kids is that there's no filter and there's no such concept of being offended. Like, that comes much later. That comes in adolescence, maybe preteen years, but under the age of 10, it's very hard for a kid to get offended. They will ask very point blank, well, why do you do that? And why did you do this? And how come you're doing it differently? And you see these interactions that are very matter of fact. And kids will naturally be like, okay, oh, I understand why you're doing that. We kind of are trained out of this natural developmental stage that happens, mostly through schooling. Sad to say, but schooling is conformity. You have to follow the rules. You have to come in by the bell. You got to do your homework. It is just the most intense series of rules that happen. I think that's also why you see more homeschooling happening in this day and age than ever before, is to create different environments for different learners. But I would say kids are the hope, I believe, in this movement, because that generation is soon going to be the generation that is leading. And they will have grown up as my kids will be the first generation where this is completely normal. And so that allows for a different narrative to be shared in society.
Justine, thank you so much for sharing your perspective and helping us explore these questions around ethics, communication, and neurodiversity. Your reflections remind us that understanding difference isn't just about policy or terminology, it's about humility, curiosity, and meaningful conversations.
Paul, I just want to thank you so, so much. It was it was an honor to come on this podcast and just to see my own growth since 2021 when I hosted a very basic, like, what is neurodiversity podcast. Like I have been able to reflect on my own journey, also see where I need to go as an individual. And so I just feel, I'd love to hear feedback from this community. If you want to reach me, I'm pretty easy to find. If you Google me, I'm on LinkedIn, and you can reach out, send me a message, and I'd love to chat further because like I said, the journey continues.
As we wrap up today's conversation with Justine Jecker, I keep coming back to one idea. We're still at the very beginning of understanding neurodiversity, and that matters. What stood out to me wasn't just the information. It was the reminder that humility is required, that we grow by listening, questioning, and adjusting. Because this work isn't abstract, it's lived. It shows up in how we design systems, how we speak to one another, what we assume is normal, and what we're willing to question. If there's one takeaway I hope you carry with you, it's this. Understanding begins with curiosity, not certainty. For those of you who see yourselves in this conversation, your experience is real. Your voice matters. And change takes time. And for those listening from a place of responsibility, pause, reflect, notice your lens. Growth doesn't require perfection. It requires awareness. We don't move culture forward through outrage alone. We move it forward through conversation, through humility, through staying in the room. So wherever you're listening from today, thank you. Thank you for choosing nuance. Thank you for choosing reflection. Thank you for choosing to keep building. Choose nuance, choose understanding, and keep the conversation going. This is the Neurodiversity Voices Podcast, and we'll continue the conversation next time.